Hello and welcome to the Haaretz Podcast. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer in Tel Aviv. The announcement of a ceasefire in the Iran war launched by the U.S. and Israel caught Israelis in the middle of the night in the early hours of Wednesday, still groggy from running to their bomb shelters in the midst of missile attacks on the same night. For long hours throughout the next day, all of the information Israelis received on their future fate came from the White House and international news channels.
This morning, President Trump backing off his threat to wipe out a whole civilization, agreeing to suspend attacks on Iran for 2 weeks once the country reopens the Strait of Hormuz. Just 90 minutes before his self-imposed deadline, the president writing on social media, this will be a double-sided ceasefire.
The report said that the Israeli government had agreed to President Donald Trump's ceasefire conditions. But Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his government themselves remained silent, leaving their citizens both exhausted and confused. Eventually, we would learn that the temporary 2-week ceasefire is meant to remain in place as the U.S. and Iran negotiate between their conflicting conditions for a long-term agreement. The most crucial conflict, as far as Israel is concerned, is whether this ceasefire ties their hands when it comes to combating Iran's proxy Hezbollah on the northern border. So, what exactly just happened? What does it mean for Israel and the region? For an update on the situation following the ceasefire announcement, we return to Haaretz's senior defense analyst Amos Harel to explain. That conversation is coming up.
I'm Esther Solomon, Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz English. Around the world, the fight is on to preserve critical and independent media. Haaretz, Israel's oldest newspaper, upholds its long tradition of accurate, committed, and incisive journalism, refusing to bend its reporting to pressure from any government or leader. A digital subscription to Haaretz gives you up-to-the-minute news and analysis in English from journalists who live Israel's reality and are committed to covering the Middle East and its global repercussions.
Amos Harel, welcome to the podcast again.
Hi, Alison.
From Israel's perspective, and by Israel, I mean this time, Prime Minister Netanyahu's government. How disappointing was this result? A 2-week temporary ceasefire while negotiations continue, and the way in which it took place.
Extremely disappointing, while Netanyahu is saying the absolute opposite. He has to keep appearances. He has to tell his public, mostly his voters, that this was an enormous success. But this is not the way things actually happened. What we have is massive operational success, which, as we knew in advance, did not translate into a strategic victory. And at one point or another, President Trump has had enough of this, apparently. We still don't know how this ends, but once he decided on a 2-week ceasefire, and once negotiations are supposed to resume in Islamabad, in Pakistan, on Friday, then this is a very, very different reality. There's a huge gap between promises of a final victory and defeat of the Iranian regime and a solution to the problem of the ballistic missile threat and the nuclear threat, and what we have in reality, which is a military success, but not a final agreement and not a solution to all of those problems. I think nobody in their clear mind would bet right now that the regime would fall. Maybe within months, that could happen. Maybe we'll see a repeat of what happened in the Soviet Union 36, 37 years ago. But right now, this doesn't seem to be in the cards.
The U.S. armament is staying in the region, according to Donald Trump. He and his defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, are posturing at least as if they are ready to go back to war full scale if these Pakistani brokered talks fail. Do you think they really would?
It's a possibility. Never say never with Trump. But we saw what Trump was about and where he was heading this week, within 24 hours. In one instant, he threatened, he said something like, you've got a nice civilization there. It's a pity to see it burn. I would regret it if something bad happens to it. And then immediately after that, he's celebrating a success and he says, great, and there's going to be huge amounts of money for everybody and so on. This is the usual Trump. On the one hand, there's this bluster of, I'm a wartime president who can defeat anybody. And on the other hand, he's a businessman who wants to deal with business things and not with American boys returning home in body bags. I find it hard to believe that this would finally lead to another escalation. But I think that Trump maintains this option in case the Iranians get crazy enough not to agree on any kind of concessions or compromise. Then yes, Trump would consider another attack. But this is deeply unpopular among the American public. You know that better than I do. This is causing enormous economical problems all over the world. The energy shortage is already felt in many places. And I think as far as I can tell from his recent statements, Trump wants out.
And do you think that he will want out enough to concede to some of these points that Iran claims is on its list of agreed points, as in being able to control the Straits of Hormuz and collect taxes from tankers going through?
It's on the Iranian list. I don't think it has been agreed yet. And I think there will be some concessions from the American side, including the possibility of tolls, which is absolutely amazing, come to think of it, considering the fact that they didn't have that kind of control on the Hormuz Strait before the war. Other issues discussed there, whether it's reparations or American guarantees that Iran would never be attacked again, or securing Hezbollah in Lebanon or whatever, I'd wait and see. The verdict is not out yet. But it's quite clear that America is willing to compromise on some Iranian demands, which is, again, considering the military power that was used here, this is quite surprising.
Amos, what is going on in Lebanon? Was it supposed to be part of the ceasefire agreement and Israel violated it with its attacks on Lebanon, some very, very heavy attacks that took place on Wednesday, which resulted in missiles on Israel's north on Thursday morning? Or did Trump give Israel the green light to continue to fight Hezbollah? This seems very, very unclear.
It's not clear yet. As far as I can tell, this was not included in the ceasefire agreement, in spite of the fact that the Pakistani prime minister claims that it was. But the Israeli version of events is that Trump gave permission for more strikes. And Trump himself, I think he was interviewed by PBS. He gets interviewed every hour or so. But he told a PBS reporter that Lebanon is not included and that Israel could go ahead. But that would be solved later. What I suspect is that this was apparently a very massive strike. More than 100 people were killed. That was the bloodiest day in the war in Lebanon in this round of events. And yet this might be the final act. It might be Netanyahu threatening, Netanyahu hitting Hezbollah and causing Trump to get involved. It's quite clear that Netanyahu wants to keep this front open. It's beneficial for him to keep striking Hezbollah, to hit them and create damage there, and also create the notion among Israelis that the war still goes on. If the war goes on, then we're still under attack. There's no room for political debate. There's no room for resuming his trial, and so on. We'll have to see if Trump plays ball or whether he says enough is enough and tries to stop that as well. It's evident that the Iranians do not want this to go on. They're trying to protect what's left of Hezbollah, and they'd rather the agreement would include Hezbollah as well in order to save what they can from their military power.
Do you think there's any chance that along the way that Trump will pressure Netanyahu to stop with Lebanon?
Yes, it's a possibility. We don't know yet. But if the Iranians are already threatening retaliation in Hormuz because of what's going on in Lebanon, and if they're saying that there won't be a deal without Lebanon, he may apply pressure on Netanyahu. And this hasn't happened yet. We'll see what happens, as the president is fond of saying.
Stepping back in a wider context, when we as Israelis look back on this month plus of war,
Wasn't it fun?
What? Yeah. If we ask ourselves the philosophical question, was it worth it? As someone who really understands what was achieved and what wasn't achieved, if you ask yourself that question, do you feel whether or not it was worth it?
That's a tough one. First of all, was it justified? I tend to think that it was. I think that Iran is a huge threat. I think that there was a possibility of at least weakening the regime after the protests in January, and that there was a growing danger from Iran, especially regarding ballistic missiles. Having said all that, the same kind of old suspicions I mentioned in June 25, I can mention again. Netanyahu himself. I find it very hard to trust his calculations, his motives, because we know who this guy is and we know what makes him tick. And it's mostly about personal survival and nothing else. Having said all that, fast forward 40 days later, I think that most of the goals of this operation have not been achieved yet. Iran suffered a lot. It will downgrade their capabilities for a long time, but we haven't solved the nuclear threat, those 440 kilograms of enriched uranium. Nobody knows what would happen with that. The ballistic missiles are still there. I think there's a lot of exaggerations about what we were able to do to those arsenals of rockets and missiles. And on top of everything else, the regime seems almost as strong as ever. It's still in power, and in their view, survival is victory. As long as they remain standing after 15 rounds of boxing or whatever, for them that's enough. So considering all those goals that Netanyahu stated publicly as we began this war, we haven't been able to reach them. So it's not, Israel did not lose this. And life in, I think I've said that to you before, life in Tehran is 20 or 30 times more miserable than it is even up north in Israel currently. And yet, if you talk of full victory or wiping out an existential threat, this hasn't happened, and it hasn't happened again. We were promised twice, in June last year and in March of this year, and in both cases, this did not materialize. Will this translate into political damage to Netanyahu? I don't know. And, we've been eulogizing his political career for so many times. Think of October 7th. At that time, people were sure that he should go home after that. Never happened.
Mm-hmm. But now he's promised total victory in Gaza, in Lebanon with Hezbollah, and with Iran. He hasn't delivered anything close to total victories in this case. So we have no idea if this is going to do him substantial political damage in an election year.
Again, I would restrain my enthusiasm about this because we've seen the hardcore Bibi supporters managing to explain almost everything that he does and justify every calculation and every wrong decision. And yet I think some people would have questions and see this unbreachable gap between the reality and his promises. Will that be the knockout effect that will change everything in Israeli politics? I doubt it, because so much of this is about identity politics.
Even without achieving his goal, he can say, look at me. I had the ability to convince the United States to go to war against our greatest existential threat. And how can any of these alternatives to my leadership do that?
And he's up to his old tricks of blaming the left. It's all because the left did not support me. It's all because the people were not persuaded to support the government and more military action. We'll see more and more of these excuses. It was fascinating to see because a ceasefire was reached during Pesach. And people who are not online during that time did not get the message yet, what they had to say to justify what has happened. So there were 12 or 18 hours in which it was the opposition narrative that ruled discussions on social media in Israel. And right now you see the talking points, but they're not very, at least in my view, they're not very persuasive because it's very, very hard to defend this gap between promises and the actual results.
It was very striking that we were getting our information about the ceasefire from the White House, from international media, and nothing coming from our own government.
That's true, and that's not the first time. And we even saw that in Gaza, if you may recall, 2016, 17, 18, when there were rounds of violence. It was always Hamas that announced a ceasefire, and it took Israel quite a few hours, the different Netanyahu governments, to admit that they were actually stopping the fighting. So the same thing happens here on a much wider scale, but it's not a surprise for me because Netanyahu has never told us the truth, and this only got worse in recent years since the October 7th massacre.
Part of the question of whether or not it was worth it, it looks like a narrative is developing in the United States in which we have Netanyahu constantly talking into Trump's ear, convincing him that regime change in Iran is possible, convincing him that all these unrealistic scenarios will play out, convincing him to attack Iran. Specifically, I'm referring to the scenario described in the recent New York Times article. How will it affect Israel's standing, or what's left of it, in the United States? Kind of part of what I'm asking is this greater damage when it comes to U.S. support for Israel possibly part of the calculation of that it wasn't worth this adventure?
I should mention I'm not an expert on American-Israeli relations, but I think that this New York Times story is probably the most damaging to Israel's position in the United States. I've seen for years. I wrote, I'll quote myself, but what I wrote this morning is that this is perhaps the worst episode in Israeli-American relations since the Pollard scandal of fiasco of 85, 86. It is extremely damaging to read this. Israel portrayed as persuading Trump to step into this trap. One thing we can feel fortunate about is that America did not pay with blood. There were not many American soldiers killed yet. But think of a scenario in which this war deteriorates and more American boys die there. That could be extremely damaging. I think already, if you look at the polls, we're losing support even among the MAGA crowd, but also, of course, among young Democrats, young Republicans, and so on. That's becoming a very big deal. And of course, this has not been explained to the Israeli public in any way. Netanyahu is ignoring this completely. He's denying that this is happening.
Only if you watch CNN or international channels when you're here, international media.
Haaretz,
yeah, you understand what's happening. We're going to have a very tense 2 weeks ahead of us as these negotiations happen. I happen to look at the calendar and notice that the deadline for the 2 weeks runs out right around Israel Independence Day. So it's going to be a very tense and stressful Independence Day.
Yes, but at least there will be some time to breathe. And I think the Israeli population needs that after 40 days of a very hard war.
In the meantime, the northern residents aren't breathing.
No, that's true.
There's a very different atmosphere between what's happening in the center of the country and the north.
Israel north of Haifa and south of Haifa, these are two different states by now.
Well, I guess we'll talk in 2 weeks and see what's happening then. In the meantime, thank you for the update on this very mixed feeling that we have of relief from the constant missile attacks and worry and concern over what this means. Amos Harel, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And that's it for this episode of the Haaretz Podcast. Thanks to my guest, Amos Harel, and producer Dan Brumer, and editor Mor Opfer. If you'd like to continue to listen to the podcast and never miss an episode, subscribe to us on Apple, on Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're inclined, leave us a 5-star rating and a comment, and that way more people can find us. And to keep up with all the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe to and follow Haaretz.com. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.